Hello.
Hello.
Miss Morrow, this is Brad. This is Rex Stetson.
Miss Morrow, Brad Allen.
There's something in the air in the late 50s.
We're on the cusp of the sexual revolution.
America was ready for this kind of sexuality.
This was a big, big hit.
A huge popular success.
They got rave reviews and the lines are going around the block.
I think it's fascinating.
Pillow talk.
Pillow talk.
Pillow talk.
Pillow talk is a time capsule. It's a reflection of its time. If you saw it when it came out with someone you were in love with, it brings all of that back.
Like being around a pot-bellied stove on a frosty morning.
People loved Pillow Talk, and it was thought of as a clean sex comedy. It was sexy without being dirty.
I think it is an ideal date film. I still believe that men and women like to go to films to feel good about romance.
If you wanted to believe this was really about a virgin being pursued by a bachelor who's going to mend his terrible ways, you can actually read Pillow Talk that way. If you want to read this film as a wayward playboy who's plugging into the untapped desires of a unfulfilled career woman, you can read it that way.
What am I missing?
When you have to ask, believe me, you're missing it.
For modern audiences, it's an important chapter in the development of the romantic comedy. There's the great screwball comedies in the 30s and early 40s. There's this transition in the 50s and early 60s, of which Pillow Talk is one of the key films, in which they're sort of like finding their way in the new world, just the way Jan and Brad are trying to figure out the modern rules.
Miss Morrow, why are you so fascinated with my personal affairs?
I'm not fascinated, Mr. Allen. Revolted.
I think it's a terrific format for a film. A man and a woman who are together all the time, but refuse to admit that they're crazy about each other, so they fight.
You don't see me going down to the phone company complaining about your affairs.
I have none to complain about.
It figures.
It's really part and parcel of that time in the late 50s, early 60s, where we're on the cusp of the sexual revolution. Doris Day is this single career woman who, when she dates, she dates. On the other hand, this party line. Who has party lines now?
Have you any idea what it's like to be on a party line with a sex maniac?
There are certain elements that date the film, but for its time period, it remains a very charming romantic comedy.
I think Pillow Talk stands up really well. It looks fabulous. That very glossy 1950s retro sheen has stayed classic, and it still looks fabulous today.
I can't tell you how embarrassing this is, Mr.
Stetson, ma'am. Rex Stetson.
Doris Day and Rock Hudson have very, very strong, clear on-screen chemistry. They're both still gorgeous to look at, and they work very, very well together. The story, which is basically a classic battle of the sexes, it's kind of a control freak battling with a commitment phobe, and that story doesn't date, and in fact feels very modern.
Don't take your bedroom problems out on me.
I have no bedroom problems. There's nothing in my bedroom that bothers me.
Oh, that's too bad.
If you look at a lot of the romantic comedies of the 1950s, they're bad remakes of the great films of the 1930s. Ross Hunter, the producer, decided he was going to try to bring the genre back to life.
Hunter was a major producer of the 50s, very successful. Had done a whole lot of tearjerker women's pictures, so-called. And the woman has a big part, but the woman is really dominated by male attitudes. And I think here you see Hunter looking around him and saying, well, I'm meeting women in real life that aren't quite like those women.
All right. You can stay till AA comes for you. I am leaving.
Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique is not published until 1963. Now, clearly, she's coming from somewhere, and she just didn't invent it. So there's something in the air in the late 50s that's starting a kind of reconsideration of what gender roles might be.
It's mighty late for a young lady to be out driving alone.
It's not very far.
The contraceptive pill wasn't widely available in the 1950s, and so for a lot of women, there was a real danger around having sex out of marriage, that they would be lumbered with an unwanted pregnancy. And of course, once the contraceptive pill became available, women were able to have sex outside marriage much more freely. Pillow Talk is made on the cusp of this era. Doris Day's character really doesn't want to become pregnant as a single woman.
If you were to become pregnant, you'd jump right to the top of our list.
Mr. Conrad, being single, I'm not quite ready for that kind of emergency.
In terms of Hollywood film production, I think there are things that are contributing to the fact that by the end of the 1950s, something like a more scandalous double entendre bedroom comedy can be produced. The first thing is the kind of commonplace of the career woman who has appeared in Hollywood movies really since the beginning of the 1940s. The second thing is that producers are getting tired of the constraints of the production code. And the third thing is the Kinsey reports that begin being published in the 1950s. Although they didn't have an immediate effect on people changing mores, they did make it evident that the mores in some ways had already changed.
How long do you think it would take you to get packed up?
About an hour.
45 minutes?
We're wasting time.
What you feel is the filmmakers responding to a growing awareness that the audience is probably behaving sexually in new ways, and that the films are a little bit limping along behind behavior, and they've got to catch up.
I'll never forget last night.
You can't even have a married couple in the same bed together in a movie in the 1950s. That's how repressed it was at the time. So this is kind of pushing at the envelope. Pillow Talk doesn't go too far, but it certainly goes farther than anything that they would have seen up to that time.
It's none of your business what he does to me, or when.
One of the things Pillow Talk does is to play off double meanings.
I'm an inspector.
What would you like to inspect?
You.
A Variety reviewer for Pillow Talk said that it was about as broad as traffic would allow in terms of the possibility of the innuendos in the film.
I mean, we've received a complaint about you.
Oh, well, I've never had any complaints before.
One of the most interesting ways of looking at it, I think, is that it's both daring and nervous at the same time. And it takes a step forward and then half a step back.
Jan is very modern on the one hand, but she also has very definite old-fashioned values. Brad lies to her. Well, I will not put up with that in a man. He cannot disrespect me like that. And she walks out on him. And so she's kind of navigating this transition to the new world. That's, I think, a reason why these films might seem old-fashioned to some people today, because it's very much the world of 1959. But in 1959, it's like, yeah, we're confused too. Doris, help us out.
Stop! His name isn't Rex Stetson, it's Brad Allen.
I know that.
He's a sneaking, double-crossing rat.
I know that, too.
But I think well-meaning audiences would have thought the film was slightly naughty. It's a stretch to concede that now, but that's what they felt.
At least you could have had the decency to bring your own champagne.
1950s America was in some ways a very complacent, prosperous, smug time, but was also a very anxious, difficult time. The fear of communism, testing the atom bombs. And I think Doris Day wrongfully has come to represent the more retrograde aspects of 1950s America, whereas actually in Pillow Talk, she's playing a very modern woman, a career woman. She's not wearing an apron. She's got a gorgeous Manhattan apartment. She's at the top of her career. She wears fabulous clothes.
In a way, she's embodying the kind of cross and clashing currents of 1959. On the one hand, a kind of conservatism and nostalgia for an older time and for a virtue. On the other hand, this kind of simmering possibility.
Oh, come on, Jen. Finish your drink. It's very nourishing.
Who are the big female sex figures in the 1950s? There's Marilyn Monroe, who is, this male fantasy figure. There's Audrey Hepburn, who is this, ethereal dream girl, also a fantasy figure. And then there's Doris Day, who's the girl next door. Women aren't threatened by her. And quite the contrary, they go, oh, look how she's making herself over. I can do that. And men go, oh, she's attainable.
The thing about Doris Day is that she appears to be repressing some tremendous sexual energy. It's not the energy that counts. It's not what you see. It's what you think is being held back. And that's why she's sexy, because she always makes you want more. And she's never going to give it to you.
Well, they didn't hit the moon with the first missile shot either.
I guess that's what I want. To hit the moon.
People thought she was pretty, smart, funny, sexy, but sexy in a sort of controllable way.
Ross Hunter said, I want to make movies about beautiful people. He first goes to Doris Day and tells her that she's a very sexy woman. And what are you talking about? She had been basically playing these clean-cut, apple-cheeked farm girl next door sort of characters.
In Pillow Talk, she's dressed for the first time by a designer called John Louis, who's a couturier designer for the movies. He is actually responsible for that white backless maxi dress that she wears where she's doing the rumba, and Rock Hudson first sets eyes on her. It's a very sexy dress. The back is an erogenous zone. You often see Doris Day's back in this movie, and you also see her very shapely backside.
So that's the other end of your party line.
In this film, for the first time, she seemed to have a sophisticated sexuality. And I think that's why people think that this was a breakthrough for Doris Day.
Not only did she get an Oscar nomination, much to her surprise, this relaunched her career. For the next 4 or 5 years, she was the #1 box office drawer in the country. And she continued making movies until I think about 1968. And then she did television. She had a TV series that lasted a few years and then kind of retired, although she's done some talk shows and things like that. But that whole second chapter of her movie career comes out of Pillow Talk.
You'll find that most people are willing to meet you halfway, if you let them.
Her real life did not turn out anywhere near as happily as many of her films, but I still think that in memory the public is immensely fond of her. She's an icon.
Am I going to see you tonight?
Rock Hudson had worked his way up through B-movies. In the 1950s, however, he started working in a series of melodramas where he was first recognised as having serious dramatic potential. He'd received an Oscar nomination in 1956 for his role in Giant opposite James Dean and Elizabeth Taylor. And so he'd gained credibility, but his career at this point had reached a plateau and needed some sort of refreshing or updating. Ross Hunter, who had also produced Magnificent Obsession, saw the potential for comedy in Rock Hudson.
Hudson had never done a romantic comedy before. He had never done a comedy before. And he said, what am I supposed to do with this? And so he agreed to do it because he trusted Ross Hunter, a chance to work with Doris Day. And when he got to the set, he said to Michael Gordon, the director, I'm not really clear what to do here. And Michael Gordon gave him the advice that he followed for his comedies. He said, you play it absolutely straight. You play this like this is the greatest tragedy in the world. Let the audience find the comedy in it. Don't you go for the laughs. And that's how he did it.
I'd like to make an appointment for an examination.
For your wife?
No, I'm not married.
And also, funnily enough, he was a little bit nervous about having to play a songwriter and having to sing. He wasn't a singer in any way, which is quite ironic given that he's playing against Doris Day, who was one of the most talented singers of her day.
He's very good at playing subtle comedy.
You ought to quit all this chasing around. Get married.
Why?
What he does is he becomes kind of the new Cary Grant.
There comes a time when a man wants to give up that kind of life.
Why?
Hudson at this time, without question, was perceived by the American public as a hunk and a wonderful, romantic, attractive young man.
What a marvelous-looking man. I wonder if he's single.
I don't know how long I can get away with this act.
Rock Hudson in 1959 has just been divorced and is a single man. And as far as the world is concerned, is dating all these starlets. Even the people he's working with, Doris Day and Tony Randall, assume he's exactly what he appears to be. They have no idea that he's a closeted gay man.
There are some men who just, they're very devoted to their mothers. You know, the type that likes to collect cooking recipes.
I saw Pillow Talk when it came out. I don't think there was a hint of irony or underground meaning. Now, I'm not saying that a few people in the audience couldn't pick up residences from Hudson, but the films he made were not dealing with it at all.
In the films, you see things that now in retrospect, like in Send Me No Flowers, he ends up in bed with Tony Randall.
God, you've got cold feet.
Now, if people knew, what the real story was, I don't think they would have done that scene.
I could complain a little too, you know. You ever cut your toenails?
Hudson's sexual preferences were kind of an open secret in the sense that those who were in the know knew and those who weren't didn't.
Doris Day, when Rock Hudson publicly came out and said he had AIDS, she said she really had no idea. And Tony Randall said, he might have heard something, but he dismissed it because, there was Rock Hudson in the news. He's with some starlet at some movie premiere.
I remember there was a quite poignant reunion with Doris Day, and it was clear that he was dying, yet he looked, in many ways, more handsome than he had ever looked. And you just felt the tragedy of deceit that had been imposed upon him in the name of his career, and which I think was the beginnings of an attitude to AIDS that needed to be brought home to the public. I mean, it was very important in the education about AIDS, I think.
Yes?
My name is Brad Allen, and
Mr. Allen, of course. I'm one of your most devoted listeners.
I think the film also plays off people like Thelma Ritter and Tony Randall very well. Those supporting players are always valuable in films like this. They make us feel that really the paper-thin plot is plausible and grounded.
Tony Randall and Thelma Ritter began as stage actors and had long and fairly successful careers on the stage. Thelma won a Tony.
Okay, I'll take your word for it.
Thelma Ritter was a very popular character actress who absolutely specialised in playing the kinds of roles she plays in Pillow Talk.
You know I never get into focus until 10 o'clock.
She could do comedy. She could do drama. She was in Rear Window for Alfred Hitchcock.
She got into films when she was 45, and that's pretty late. So she was pretty much limited to playing these older women, lower class, secondary character roles in which she was incredibly successful.
She's also known for having lost the Oscar 5 or 6 times. It's not the record, but she was nominated many times because she was sort of like, for supporting actresses, she was the actress's actress. Everybody adored her. She was just, she could steal a scene with a throwaway line.
Well, what is a girl supposed to do? Go out in the street and ask the first man she meets to come home with her?
No, don't do that, ma'am. It don't work.
This was, I believe, her 5th nomination for Pillow Talk. She didn't even bother going to the Oscars that year. Instead, she sent invitations out to her friends and threw a come watch me lose again party. And of course, she lost again.
I think when she came on screen, audiences said, now we're going to have 10 minutes of fun.
She drinks too much in Pillow Talk, and she also has some of the best sort of withering put-downs. Thelma Ritter kind of specialised in those.
Beatnik, party pooper, get lost.
Her role is always to tell the characters what we, the audience, already know. She's the filmic equivalent of something like a Shakespearean fool. She knows what we know. She knows what pragmatic, common sense people know. She voices that.
Takes only one sip of wine to tell if it's a good bottle.
She tells Jan throughout the film what Jan really wants.
This is a good bottle.
Well, what are you waiting for? Drink up.
Of course, the whole time, she doesn't really see what she wants, which is, of course, to hook up with the elevator operator.
Why, Harry, you're so strong.
So by the end of the film, she gets her romantic fulfillment as well. But we like her because she's us. And she also operates and tries to get things to go the way we know they ought to be going. Even then, and she's usually fairly effective, but it may take her a little while.
Now, let's take this problem from the beginning.
I lost her halfway through the vodka.
This'll fix you up. It's got a lot of olive oil in it.
Tony Randall was interesting because really we talk about these films as being Doris Day and Rock Hudson movies, but of course Tony Randall is in all of them, and he's as much part of the chemistry and as much part of what makes the films work as Doris Day and Rock Hudson.
Tony Randall, of course, very young in this film, but at the start of a great, great career.
I started at the top. I've done it the hard way.
Essentially as a feed to other people, a very, very generous kind of acting that just sets other people up, rather than really plays lead roles himself.
Probably what people most remember him for is Felix Unger from the Odd Couple TV series. But what's interesting with Tony Randall, with Pillow Talk, he was considered such an important part of the success of the film that he appears in Lover Come Back and Send Me No Flowers. They couldn't do a Rock Hudson Doris Day film without Tony Randall. In fact, years later, when there was actually serious talk about doing a Pillow Talk sequel, it was with the 3 of them.
He makes a great contrast with Rock Hudson in these movies, of course, because Rock Hudson is so big and strong and tall and gloriously handsome and sexy. And Tony Randall plays the little, slightly emasculated, neurotic man dependent on his analyst. A real fusspot.
Now look at us. We went through college together. You worked your way through. You started out with nothing and you've really made something out of yourself. Me, I started out in college with $8 million and I've still got $8 million. I just can't seem to get ahead.
There was a film a few years back called Down with Love with Renee Zellweger and Ewan McGregor. It pays homage to Doris Day and Rock Hudson.
But what was interesting about it was they cast Tony Randall as the head of the publishing company that one of the characters works for. The idea was, Rock Hudson was gone, Doris Day was retired, but you had to have one of them there just, to let everybody know this is what we're doing. And so it's Tony Randall's last film.
By rights, these loose teeth belong to you.
You couldn't do these films without him.
Have you talked to her?
No, I've decided to give her up on the advice of my psychiatrist, also my dentist.
Pillow Talk received 5 Oscar nominations. It won for Best Screenplay, but it was also nominated for Best Score, Best Actress, Best Supporting Actress, and Best Art Direction. To see a film that's paced so beautifully, 4 actors at the peak of their powers, the set design, the costumes, everything is at its best in Pillow Talk. It's an absolute classic of its kind.
Officer, arrest this man. He's taking me up to his apartment.
Can't say as I blame him, miss.
Pillow Talk did very well. They had a blockbuster. It did enough to spawn the next 10 years of romantic comedies.
Mommy, where is that man taking that lady?
Shh, I'll tell you when you're older.
If you were trying to figure out where was romance, where were American couples, where was the American man and woman at that time, you could do worse than to watch Pillow Talk.
Remember when I said that being near you was like being near a pot-bellied stove?
Pillow Talk is a film well worth seeing, well worth bringing back, because it's about love, sex, romance. We're all interested in those things.
More like a forest fire, completely out of control.
And it's about the way our parents thought about those things, which is obviously of enormous importance in that it must have been the conversation that led to your conception.